it's called Confusing the Myths with Some Facts. A lot of cybersecurity myths out there, so we're going to dive into a few of those today. And the first one is the one that I mentioned earlier, that's around kind of IP threat lists. Something that's been around a very long time, and I think something that has always been kind of questionable. The objective is obviously to create this blacklist where you should have the confidence to apply it and then block everything on that blacklist. But of course, unless it's 100% effective or near 100%, you can't really rely on that. People haven't really taken that leap. And what our research team wanted to do was actually, we've got all this data using IP intelligence, and we have a set of customers where we can test this theory. So what we wanted to do was find out. We had a hunch that it was maybe going to be around 15% effective. This is meant to be a large and confusing diagram. This is all the kind of process where the data goes, all the different processes that we do. But we collect logs, we collect research data, we collect external intelligence. We have a number of kind of back-end portals, and we also have a honeypot deception techniques we use to try and lure attackers in and try and gain intelligence that way. That's also going to be quite important here. We have the SecureData Labs team and SensePost, which is our pen testing arm. So we're getting 20% of our pen testers' time is dedicated to research, which is quite rare in the pen testing industry. So we have a lot of information to consume. But what it really boils down to is, there are a lot of things that we kind of take for granted in cybersecurity as universal truths, and some of those are what we're going to talk about here. Really, we want to question those, and a lot of this is it's not my story, it's the story of our Chief Research Officer and his team, and some of those rabbit holes that they went down. So a bit of background. I talked about intelligence-led security in the first session this morning, and predicting the methods of adversaries. How good is IP intelligence in doing that? And there are a lot of people out there talking about this is the way to do security. It's a great way to get ahead. It's also kind of been commoditized a little bit. You see these flashy numbers. Steve from Fortinet flashed through it this morning. These big numbers. 12 million unique URLs. This is an example from a feed, one of the feeds that we were going to analyze during this test. 12 million unique URLs, 640 million unique users, 1.2 billion unique devices. They're big numbers. They're impressive, right? We should really trust in this because there's big numbers behind it. Well, does it actually work? This was the story that our research team went on. Really? And we had a hunch not. And this was the experiment that we did. Given that an IP address is acting suspiciously and triggers one of our alerts in our managed threat detection environment, would we see it again either in that customer or another customer over a period of 6 months behaving maliciously as confirmed behaviors? And actually what we saw was for this IP address block list that less than 4%, as I mentioned earlier. Even somewhat encouraging was our HoneyNet lab, but even that was less than 15%. So actually, sometimes you've just got to go with your basic instinct, and that's what we did here. It was worthwhile doing this piece of research, and I'm sure you'll see more of this. I think we're going to do a follow-up with all of the data we get now from the wider Orange Cyberdefense group, which includes some of that mobile operator backbone information as well, another source of intelligence, particularly when it comes to where some of the bad stuff is being hosted. So that's kind of the precursor. I've talked about that already. The next piece of research is kind of delving a bit deeper into VPNs. VPNs are inherently known as this really secure thing. And there was, again, a starting point for this. We've called it virtually private networks, and you'll see why as we go through. This again started at some monitoring that we were doing with our managed threat detection team. And there were 2 employees at the same hotel. And we saw outbound traffic on port 445, which is the port used by SMB. Again, that's been exploited a lot. You've seen that a lot in the news. Things like WannaCry exploited that particular service. And this traffic was sent, in the morning within an hour of each other. It's the same complimentary hotel Wi-Fi. And we saw something weird. We saw some important clues in that. We saw this strange behavior, and it triggered some of our alarms, and we started looking deeper, and we initiated then an incident response investigation to go a bit deeper. Because we'd done some of our normal analysis within the managed threat detection team where we were looking for, was there anything else that could tie this behavior together? Had we, this IP address, could we tie it to anything? Could we tie it to any malware that we'd seen before? any kind of DNS attacks that we'd seen, phishing emails, we couldn't find anything. And actually, when we went onto those machines, we found something interesting. We found that the server name they were trying to connect to was an internal print server, printer HQ. But the server address was actually an external IP address. So they were looking for an internal server on an address that was on the internet. That's where it started to get suspicious. Bit of Cluedo, IP address 66.96.162.92 in the kitchen with a knife. And what we found was, actually this was just connecting to a domain.com with wireless access points. If you don't define a specific domain to go to, there is a thing, a DNS search suffix, and it will go to just the kind of out-of-the-box, in this case, domain.com. And that was just the out-of-the-box configuration. So in this particular investigation, it was fairly benign. This was what it was going to. It was going to this domain.com. So unless you specify a specific domain that my machine should go to, and we're going to get to talk on VPNs, because with VPNs, this is thought to be the behavior that it will override this. And if you're logging into a wireless access point, you'll go to the domain that's specified by your corporate network, rather than this kind of general one that was just an out-of-the-box configuration. So, and this is just again how that works. So it's a common thing. It's how it's supposed to behave. So we have this problem though with that, in that obviously one of the more common attacks that we see is an attacker perhaps hijacking that wireless access point and being able to inject a fake DNS entry to send you wherever they want to send you. So we've got the request to the real website, they'll inject that fake DNS, send you where they want to send you, and you'll go to the fake website. Common attack, often used to harvest credentials, because one of the other things that SMB does is, because it's communicating to print servers and things like that, is it sends your credentials. Now it sends them with a hash password, but it still sends something that is that you shouldn't really be sending out. So one of the ways around this, of course, as I mentioned, is VPNs. Right? VPNs keep us safe. We sort of circumnavigate this so that we're going back to our corporate HQ DNS service. That's where we'll get our access from, and then we'll inherit all of the policies and the filtering that we have there. But how effective are modern VPN products at protecting us against this particular thing that we uncovered? The research team, again, decided that they might just investigate this a little further, because this just didn't sit right with us. And it didn't sit right, again, a basic instinct of our chief research officer. He flies a lot. And it got him thinking, I connect to an awful lot of these capital portals whilst I'm flying around, usually inside the airport now. You can pretty much get on Wi-Fi in any airport. And you join this captive portal. So when you do that, of course, there's this kind of lag, of course, because you have that moment before you connect to the VPN. To connect to a VPN, you need internet access. And to get the internet access, you need to connect to the captive portal. So there's this lag period. And that's the period at which you're subject to this attack. So actually, are VPNs effective in this manner? Are they the protection? Well, we're going to talk about that. Maybe they are, but maybe we have this gap. And this gap is, again, all that you need when you're an attacker to exploit this security hole. And again, this is where you can see, we've detected the portal. Again, in this, it's picked up that Wi-Fi workspace. We tested this. And we tested it. Our chief research officer did what any good research officer does and test it on himself. And he found that, sure enough, before he connected to the VPN, he was broadcasting information about his machine, including his host name, which again can be exploited, because if you're connecting to want to connect to a network and don't want to be discovered, maybe follow the host name convention, unless that company's got a really bad host name convention, then you can just hide really easily. And so that was one thing. The other thing, of course, and we all see this, right? When we connect to these captive portals, immediately when we connect to the captive portal, all of everything that's trying to connect automatically, all these applications start buzzing up and flashing these big messages at us. Should we connect? So they're warning us about this. It's the same with mobiles. So one slight difference with mobiles, of course, is that you have maybe a connection, 3G or 4G, before you connect to the captive portal. So potentially you can connect to the VPN before you connect to the captive portal. And it will carry over if you do that. So there is some extra mitigation with mobiles. But yeah, sure enough, we saw this activity, tried it on his phone as well, saw the same thing. So what's also the problem with this, particularly with Zoom, the one you'll see in the middle here, is that you do have to say, yeah, do you want to trust it anyway? It gives you the warning. But with Zoom, they've created this big bright blue button that says trust anyway, and then a little gray cancel one. You know, it's telling us, please click me, don't worry about that, be fine. You know, so that's part of the problem. And there are a lot of applications that do this. A lot of Microsoft applications do it. Zoom, Slack, Office 365. We have so much when we start up our machine that is trying to connect to the internet. And again, it's trying to do that for convenience, but it's leaving us with a big security hole that could be exploited. What you do have within VPNs now, since they noticed this, you know, we again thought, right, is there anything they can do? And we work with a lot of the leading VPN products with the kind of product side of the business. So we went back to them and said, can you actually stop this? And there is now this lockdown mode. So you can enforce kind of a lockdown mode that's supposed to mitigate this problem, to basically stop any kind of communication before you establish the VPN. And we tested it. We saw that it worked. But then we also saw that for certain things it didn't work. For DNS, it didn't work. So why was that? And that's because convenience. There are certain services that these VPN lockdown modes are allowing by default outside of the lockdown mode because they're seen as essential services. And again, this is a lot of the things that we use to connect. So you've got, you know, again, the SMB protocol, DNS, things that our machines just need to kind of connect to everything they need to connect to. And a lot of this is kind of Microsoft-driven behavior, but also on Mac as well. So even when you lock down the machine, this thing is still there, which is crazy. This is an example where we took some of the captures again. You can see with all of the kind of packet captures, they've got the number on the left-hand side there. We've established the encrypted tunnel, and yet still we have the connection to the Wi-Fi, wherever it wants to take us. And within this, one of the reasons I'm showing this is because it leads on to the next section, but we can see, you can't see it great on this screen, but you can see there's a password hash there. So you can still capture the password hash information. So I'm going to talk about mitigations for this later on, because there is things that we can do. But this was just an incredible kind of little journey for us to go on. There's a blog that we're currently uploading to share on this piece of research as well. And that gets us onto the password problem. Okay, so yes, we've lost the password hash, but you know that's designed to be, you know, encrypted. It's designed to be just there for precisely this kind of situation. If we lose that password, at least it's hashed. Well, we did some more research with hashed passwords. We have, I think, a collection of around about 2.5 million hashed passwords that we've cracked, again, through the pen testing team. And so we've found some common patterns in that allows us actually, with not a great deal of compute power, a reasonable amount, to be able to crack even hashed passwords. And this was our success rate. Differs a little per country, and this is the source country where the passwords came from, but 80%. So 8 out of every 10 hashed passwords we could crack within, I think, 48 hours. And interestingly, there's also this myth about the complex passwords, right? Well, 88% of the passwords that we cracked were 8 to 12 characters long. They were following a complex password format. The problem with that is that you see patterns. We see human behavior. Again, going back to the very thing we were discussing earlier, is human behavior is still there. So even if you make the passwords complex, you still have that human behavior. I have to be able to remember it. And surprising number, 12% of those passwords contain the year. You know, this was 2018. So they contain 2018 somewhere in it. People just go, you know, May 2018, whatever, you know, cat. And so you pick up on these patterns when you're doing this kind of research. So this is how we do it. It's not difficult. And if we can do it, absolutely the attackers can. So yeah, these are some of the common patterns that we saw. So how do we make it right? How do we, you know, what can we do about some of these things? I think from the intelligence point of view, going back to that problem, a lot of what Steve was talking about with AI, it resonates with me. I hate the term AI as well. It's machine learning. One of the things that is kind of a common misconception is AI actually is kind of the right definition, but we have a misconception of it. We see AI, because of science fiction movies, as artificial intelligence is the replication of the human mind. Well, actually, it's not. The actual definition is artificial general intelligence. That's what we're striving for. Some people are striving for it. Hopefully, that never happens, because that could be crazy. But actually, artificial intelligence is replicating functions of the human mind. And again, I'm happy to talk to anyone about that kind of, afterwards about that, because it really is an area where there's a lot of kind of disinformation and actually, what we're trying to do is replicate specific tasks of the human mind. It's all we can do right now, because the human mind is too complicated. So what can you do? I mentioned some of the Microsoft and Windows behavior. Mac and iOS and Android are inherently more secure for some of these things, but they're not immune. But it just does reduce the risk. Unfortunately, obviously, that's not the typical business profile. So it's not really a solution. But it's definitely one of the things to maybe consider. Maybe for some of those high-value targets within your organization, it's all about feasibility there, right? We went back to the VPN vendors, and you can configure this primary DNS within the lockdown mode that we talked about earlier, but it's not set by default. It's something you have to go in and configure. So it's one of these things that could easily be missed if you buy one of these products, enable the lockdown mode, and don't configure this extra part that's there. So there is the ability to do that. But that's only on the DNS front. There's some of the other things that we talked about, SMB, for example. So we're releasing threat advisories on stuff like this all the time. Again, going back to one of the points that was made earlier was about relevant information. We try and bring not just information about every kind of vulnerability, but something that's really captured our imagination, that's on our radar, that has a high impact. And we'll release these advisories. These are a couple of examples of recent ones. We've been tracking, obviously, this Citrix ADC vulnerability. That's one of those rare ones where it doesn't necessarily come back. It gets discovered by the research team and then comes back through the incident response team. It's been keeping us very, very busy. That one in particular, I think it's flown under the radar a lot more than something like WannaCry did, because it's kind of not that, it's not as kind of newsworthy in the kind of sexiness of the story. But actually, it's probably the most incident response cases we've had on one single vulnerability as long as I can remember that we've been doing that. Authentication, so we've talked about passwords, we've talked about how they're just inherently not secure. Two-factor authentication, again, been around for a long time, a bit more kind of commoditized now. And obviously the more that we connect to single sign-on, things like Okta that present us with all of our cloud applications, that's, again, it's just essential. Passwords are not secure enough to look at that kind of information. And this is really a key one. This feedback comes from everywhere. It comes from our research team. The desktop is the target. It's a little bit out, very many years out of date. That the laptop is the target. The mobile is the target. Those our end machines now, because the profile of the business is changing to, a lot of cloud-first strategies. That is really the target. That's the place where you're going to connect to everything that you connect to. All of your SaaS applications, maybe some of the infrastructure you connect to in the cloud. So it really is the target, but it's also now the best place really we found to detect threats in terms of coverage. If any of you are following things like the MITRE attack framework, again, that's a really good piece of work that is really applicable here around looking at what are the threats to that endpoint machine, because it really is driving, whether it's a client machine that your users have or whether it's a server. These are our new crown jewels. And again, we get an awful lot of inquiries around things like managed SIM. Can we throw a bunch of logs into a SIM, and can you get them from the firewall, from everywhere, from network devices? Can you monitor our switches? A lot of that is really just kind of redundant traffic in terms of the visibility that you get when you do properly monitor the endpoint. people like Cybereason who are here today, which unfortunately clashed with this talk. I would have recommended going to see that. Thanks for joining me. But go and see those guys later on. It is really revolutionizing the way, becoming more like a SIM that is focused on the endpoint and really covering a lot of these common threats that actually affect our business. There's still, a lot of people ask me, is SIM dead? It's not dead. There's still a place for it. But is it the right path to start our journey if we're looking at detection and response? And I would say in many cases, no. The mantra in this type of area has always been start with the basics. And a lot of the basics do come back to the endpoint. Google actually embraced this. Google got attacked by Operation Aurora by the Chinese in 2009. And this really kind of changed their whole thinking. I mean, this is how crazily ahead of the game Google are. Like, they were basically looking at a framework that said, we don't trust anybody. Each endpoint has to defend itself. We've been hit pretty hard by this breach. We know now that everything else we're doing, we cannot assume that the endpoint is safe. And I think that is a mantra that we should all be looking at. This is not kind of industry rubbish, this kind of zero trust thing. It is absolutely where we should start looking to stop these things. And again, because a lot of this is accidental, especially when you look at environments like AWS and Azure, we've seen so much of people just leaving configuration open because they just thought it was secure because AWS or Azure will handle it. Configuration is again, as we talked about with the VPN issue, everything's there, but have we turned it on? Another thing that where you can, again, this is unfeasible for large networks. We've seen this with a lot of kind of small startups now, but using some of these tablets or Chromebooks, these types of devices inherently gives us a bit more security because there's a lot less on those machines in terms of what we have to then protect. But it comes back to again having a good strategy. Exactly what I kind of finished on this morning. Knowing who you are, knowing that footprint, knowing your threat model. All of these things are, again, I'll say it again, I said it this morning, they're basics, but they are not basic. But they are the starting points before we can try and do anything else that is complex. And I think a lot of people are starting to refocus on these things now. And they should. If we haven't done it well enough to this point, vulnerability management is the prime example. For far too long, we've been obsessed with finding the vulnerabilities, using things like CVSS score as a metric to address the criticality. That on its own isn't enough anymore because there are so many. 30% of vulnerabilities are somewhere between 8 and 10 on that CVSS scoring ratio. So that's fine if you've got 100 vulnerabilities, but most networks have hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities. And if you take 30% of that, that's not prioritizing the problem. And just, again, keep that open mind. This is our mantra. Does it work? So every time you hear one of these kind of cybersecurity myths, be questioning of it, especially when it comes to things like AI and machine learning. Do a little. My recommendation is do a little reading. I did some reading. It came from a podcast that I was listening to. It was actually not a security podcast. It was from a guy called Joe Rogan. I don't know if anyone listens to his podcast. It's incredibly popular. He's a mixed martial arts commentator. He's a stand-up comedian, but he also likes people that are interesting. So every kind of third show, he'll get somebody interesting on. And he got on a guy called Sir Roger Penrose, who's a guy who worked with Stephen Hawking on black holes. That was kind of his thing. And then as just a side thing, casual side thing, he was looking at artificial intelligence. And what they're trying to do in the Penrose Institute at the moment is map the human brain to figure out why are we still more intelligent than machines. They actually, to try and, they want to scan people's brains to try and figure this out. And they wanted to get people that think outside the box to kind of capture that kind of idea. Roger Penrose is not a religious man, but there's this kind of concept of the soul that he's kind of exploring. There's something in us, something that allows us to kind of break our boundaries. And that's the kind of thing that they're trying to map, because only when we do that can we really try and get this artificial intelligence to start working in a more intelligent way. And they posted a chess problem in the local paper, just in various papers and various journals, and said, can you solve this chess problem? If you can, please mail us. We'd like you to come in and take part in an experiment. The nature of this chess problem and chess position that it showed was, can you get a winning position? The interesting thing about the problem is even an average chess player, now I don't know what an average chess player looks like, could solve the problem and could win from that position, could at least draw. And yet, you put it through one of these chess computers, which are one of the most advanced machine learning, supposedly processors in the world, and they said you couldn't win. Why is that? And that's because there is not enough processing power for this particular position to work out all of the variables that will allow you to understand that you could win from that position. And I just found that fascinating. So I would recommend go and read, listen to some podcasts around AI. There's plenty around. It's not magic, and I think a lot of security vendors would like to have you believe it's magic so that they can just use it as an excuse. There is something behind it. So that's kind of the point I'd like to end on. I'm doing okay for time. Happy to take a couple of questions if anyone's got any, or otherwise we can head out for lunch. Okay. Thank you, everyone.